everywhere, where right and glory lead, rediscovering the story of Brother Gabriel Bullock. 100 years had passed since the end of the war that was supposed to end all wars, and across the world, peoples and nations were marking the centenary with memorial events. In the lodge of Amity in Rossendale Forest, number 283, in the Province of East Lancashire, the brethren were reflecting on how the conflict would have impacted on the lodge at the time, and in particular, on the sacrifice made by one brother, Gabriel Bullock, who went to war in 1917 and never returned. Although Brother Gabriel's name and sacrifice are documented, so many years had passed that there was no one left alive who could have claimed to have known him, and the collective lodge memory of Gabriel the man had been lost to time. Extraordinarily little was known about him, other than an entry in the lodge records relating to the Book of Declarations, and an entry in the Minute Book mentioning him being killed in action in France during the Great War. No current brother knew what he looked like, his personal story, or the circumstances in which he fell. Every year, on November the 11th, we pause to remember those who suffered and gave their lives in the service of their country. But by hearing the personal stories that lie behind the names on the monuments and plaques that stand in every community, we are better able to understand the magnitude of the debt we owe our forebears. This short film is the result of research undertaken by the brethren of Amity and Rossendale Forest, who took the opportunity of the centenary to rediscover Brother Gabriel's story in order to honour him and to ensure that his sacrifice continues to be remembered. Haslingden is one of the oldest towns in Rossendale and was the home of the lodge of Amity number 283 between 1815 and 2007. During the Industrial Revolution, its economy grew quickly due to the booming wool, cotton and quarrying industries, with many mills springing up in order to take advantage of its plentiful water supply and the power that came with it as it ran down from the moors into its valley location. By 1901, its population had swollen to over 16,300. The famous big lamp at the top of Dearden Gate stands in what was once the main commercial district in the top of the town area. From here, all of the known places where Amity met during their 192-year tenure of Haslingden can be seen. After arriving from Rochdale in 1815, the lodge began meeting at the New Inn on Manchester Road, where just over a decade later, handloom weavers were arrested for riot after they destroyed over 100 power looms in Helmshire. They were released under duress to an angry crowd, but many were later rearrested and some were transported to Australia for life. We can see that some two-storey bay windows were added to the property at some stage. The building is still in use, but is no longer a public house. The lodge continued to meet here until January 1819, when it moved to a private room in the town, where it met until October 1822. The reason for the move and its precise location are today unknown. After that, it moved to the Bull's Head on Church Street, where it continued to meet for 50 years until February 1873, before moving to the Swan Hotel at Marketplace at the top of Dearden Gate. Neither of these buildings exist anymore, having been demolished as part of a large-scale redevelopment of the area in the 20th century. From 1887, the lodge met at the Grey Mare Hotel on Regent Street, before moving in 1921 to an adjacent building they had bought and converted into a temple. 2 years later, they moved down Dearden Gate to a hall they had acquired and converted for the purpose. Whilst Amity was resident at the Grey Mare, one Gabriel Bullock was born on the 4th of October 1888 to Luke James and Elizabeth Alice. He was named after one of his father's older brothers and was baptised at St. John's, Stonefold, on the 9th of February 1890. The 1891 census shows the family living at Top of the Bank Cottage on the Old King's Highway in Acre. By this time, Gabriel was 2 years old and the youngest of 4 children. His sister, Jane Ellis, was 7. His brother, Robert H., was 8 and at school, and his half-brother, John W. Rawstron, who Elizabeth had out of wedlock, was 11. His father, Luke, who was 35 and some 4 or 5 years older than Elizabeth, gave his occupation as being a cotton weaver. The next record we have is the 1900 electoral roll, which shows Luke now living at 182 Blackburn Road in a terraced house property, which at the time doubled as a shop. Luke had undergone a change of career and by now had a hairdressing business at Station Brow. The shop was still around in 1913, as we can see from this remarkable photograph, which shows King George V and Queen Mary visiting the town in the July. In 1901, Gabriel was 12 years old, and the family were living at the Roebuck Hotel at 1 Charles Lane. His father Luke had changed professions again, and was now a licensed victualler, and his sister Jane, who was now 17, worked there as a barmaid. His brother Robert was now 20 and working as a hairdresser. His half-brother John gave his occupation as being a cotton weaver. Gabriel was soon to follow in his father and brother's footsteps and train as a hairdresser at their shop on Blackburn Road. Luke was to run the Roebuck until March 1906, when he moved his family to the same Swan Hotel that had housed the meetings of the Lodge of Amity between 1873 and 1887. He was a member of the lodge himself, having in 1906 been initiated and passed under 2 August full moons before being raised the following month. He was also a brother in the local branch of Buffaloes, but not the kind seen here. Looking up Dearden Gate in this 1905 picture, we can see the Swan Hotel is bearing his surname. He was said to be a cheerful and good-hearted character, who along with his brother played an instrument in the old 88 band. An ardent cyclist too, he was in 1908 vice-president of the Haslingden Wheelers Club. A couple of weeks before Christmas 1907, Luke came down with the symptoms of acute appendicitis. A specialist was summoned, and on New Year's Day he underwent an operation to remove it. There were complications, and on January 5th, at the age of 51, he passed away and was buried at St. James. His funeral was a large affair, with over 200 people in attendance, including 20 Freemasons, who were there in respect of departed merit. It seems likely that after this tragic event, that Gabriel felt obliged to quit hairdressing in order to help his mother manage the hotel. In January 1910, his sister married Frederick Rawstron, who interestingly had the same surname as her mother's maiden name, and moved to 22 Laburnum Street. His brother Robert, who was by now a master hairdresser, had married 5 years earlier and was living at 10 Berry Road with his wife and daughter. More tragedy would befall the family on the 7th of May 1913, when Robert would pass away, aged just 31. His half-brother John had also married and was living at Station Steps. The census shows that by 1911 there was only Gabriel and his mother left living and working at the Swan Hotel. By being a hairdresser, and then later by running a pub, Gabriel would have got to know a great many people. His large circle of friends would also have included people he knew outside of work, by being part of the congregation at the local Swedenborgian Spiritualist Church, and through his membership of the Royal Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes. He was a member of both the Haslingden Working Men's Club and of Haslingden Conservative Club, as was his brother Robert, the latter of which, with much pomp and ceremony, opened a fantastic new building in the heart of the town in 1909. It had 4 billiard tables, and it's not hard to imagine a young Gabriel puffing on his pipe there as he practised and played matches on his way to winning the Conservative Club Billiards Cup. His sporting prowess extended to cricket, and it is said that he made a fine bowler. At the age of 26, on the 16th of August 1914, he was initiated into Freemasonry, joining Amity, which was the lodge of his now deceased father. He was passed and raised during each of the next 2 months, suggesting that there was possibly an urgency to the process, perhaps prompted by the impending prospect of war. At first, enlistment to the military was a voluntary affair, and over 1 million men answered the call to arms. Gabriel was by now the hotel manager, and as such was indispensable to the business, so he continued to operate the Swan with his mother. Despite the events unfolding in Europe, the lodge continued to meet as best it could throughout the conflict. The war did not end by Christmas, as many had predicted, and as it dragged on through 1915 and the casualty count soared, pressure mounted on Parliament to find more soldiers. This resulted in the enactment of the Military Service Act in January 1916, which compelled most able-bodied men between the ages of 19 and 41 to enlist. As required, Gabriel attended the Haslington recruitment office on the 17th of February, where he signed his short service attestation form for the duration of the war. At precisely the same time, a volunteer battalion from one of Haslington's neighbouring towns who had completed their training were making their way from Southampton to France. Just a few months later, they would engage the enemy in a battle that would forever associate the name Accrington Pals and the Somme with unimaginable tragedy and grief. The days of all volunteer battalions were over, and the newly conscripted recruits were not allowed to exercise choice when it came to fulfilling a role. Men were sent to where they were most needed, and for Gabriel that meant the Royal Garrison Artillery in the Royal Artillery Regiment. Their motto is Ubique and Quo fas et gloria ducant, which translated means everywhere and where right and glory lead. His enlistment paper describes him as being 5 feet 6 1/4 inches tall and with a fully expanded chest measurement of 35.5 inches and a range of expansion of 5 inches. He was kitted up, given the service number 85432, assigned the rank of gunner in the 255th Siege Battery of the Royal Garrison Artillery, and was sent for training. Siege batteries were army troops allocated to corps as needed for particular operations, and as such did not permanently form part of any divisions. In this most mechanized and industrialized of wars, the sides formed lines that were literally dug into the countryside. To assault such well-defended positions, commanders on both sides sought to pulverize the enemy with plunging fire from distance, using high explosive shells and gas. To achieve this, they employed howitzers, which are a type of weapon that sits between the classifications of a cannon and a mortar. Although a siege battery typically consisted of 6 4-inch howitzer guns capable of delivering 100-pound shells to a distance of 6,000 yards, its logistical requirements meant the unit was no small affair. Each battery would have had 5 officers and 177 other ranks, backed by 17 riding horses, 6 draft and 80 heavy draft. Its transport consisted of 3 2-horse carts and 10 4-horse wagons. Each battery operated with 3 others as part of a siege brigade, which also included an ammunition column. There were hundreds of horses and men required to operate these units. As British artillery tactics developed, the siege batteries were most often employed in destroying and neutralizing the enemy artillery, as well as putting destructive fire down on strongpoints, dumps, stores, roads and railways behind enemy lines. Given that the range of official figures indicate that between 50 and 85% of casualties on the battlefield were due to artillery fire, it's not difficult to see why they were considered to be high-value targets. Following the completion of his training, on January 18, 1917, Gabriel found himself on a ship out of Southampton and bound for France. Precisely what he was involved with during the next few months is unclear, because the regiment's war diary is lost. What is certain, though, is he was involved in very heavy fighting in the region of northern France and southern Belgium. Travelling with him was his lockable case that contained, among other things, his hairdressing equipment, photographs, and a Masonic book. On the morning of January 19th, the ship docked in France, and Gabriel and his comrades disembarked for the battlefields. On August the 10th, 1918, what was dubbed the 100 Days Offensive commenced, which consisted of a rapid series of Allied victories against which the German armies had no reply, and which would eventually end in the armistice on November the 11th. Gabriel's 255th Siege Battery was included in the reformed Fourth Army, who were at the time fighting in the Somme. They succeeded in forcing the Germans back to the Hindenburg or Siegfried Line, enabling a weary nation back home to begin hoping that the end of the war might actually be in sight.
At home, the British people began to have the sense of victory. One by one, the headlines stilled their doubts.
August the 23rd, new British advance.
August the 24th, British front ablaze.
August the 26th, pressing the advance.
August 27th, battle front spreading.
August the 28th, Allies sweep forward.
August the 30th, the flowing tide.
The Times commented,
The arrival of our forces at Bapaume set the seal on a wonderful weekend and brought into view possibilities which were certainly not in sight a week ago. The Germans are retreating at such a pace that people are beginning to ask whether they'll be able to stand on the old Hindenburg line.
the sense of victory gripped the Allied commanders. Haig told his generals,
Risks which a month ago would have been criminal to incur ought now to be incurred as a duty.
The Allies pushed back the Central Powers, undoing their gains from the spring offensive. The advance continued, with the Fourth Army making steady progress towards the Hindenburg Line. In early September, Gabriel would have been involved in shelling enemy positions in advance of the big pushes that were to take the key towns of Ypres and Havrincourt.
Bapaume fell to the New Zealanders on August the 30th. In this battle, the British captured 34,000 men and 270 guns. Before it ended, Haig flung in his first army, attacking still further to the north, along the River Scarpe. Their fight produced 16,000 prisoners and 200 guns. And so into September, and yet another battle by the Fourth and Third Armies. 12,000 prisoners and 100 guns. It was a majestic progress at last, after long years of waiting and enduring. But the cost was high for men who had fought so long.
Advances were finally being made, but the cost was indeed high. On the 15th of September, 1918, just 57 days before the armistice, a German artillery shell aiming for the battery landed close to its mark, and Gabriel Bullock was killed in action. Second Lieutenant S. Tudor Hanks, 255 Siege Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery, British Expeditionary Force, writing to Mrs. Bullock on September the 16th, says, Dear Madam, I regret that I have to write to you news which I feel will be heartbreaking to you. Your son, Gunner Bullock, fell in action yesterday. He had mounted his motorcycle to take a dispatch when a splinter from a shell struck him in the chest. Some little consolation for you may be gathered from the fact that he was in no way disfigured, and that his death was instantaneous. He was buried this afternoon at True Court Military Cemetery near Peron, and his grave is marked with a cross, sacred to the memory of Gunner Bullock, S. Battery, killed in action, September 15th, 1918. My brother officers and all his comrades join me in saying how sorry we are at his loss, and all feel they have lost a fine and brave comrade. Gabriel's personal effects were placed in his case, and eventually made their way back to his heartbroken mother at the Swan Hotel in Haslingden. It contained the hairdressing kit that no doubt would have made him popular among his comrades, some photographs and letters, a watch, cutlery, a gold ring, a dictionary, his pipe, and a Masonic book. A memorial service was held at the Swedenborgian Church, where his name is included on a marble plaque. The Conservative Club too added him to their memorial, as did the Working Men's Club. Unusually, Haslingden's official war memorial monument bears no names, but the fallen are recorded on a roll of honour that hangs in the town's library on Dearden Gate. His name was also recorded in the National Masonic Roll of Honour 1914 to 1918. On the 17th of October 1918, following a meeting of the Lodge of Amity at the Greymare Hotel, the following entry was made into the minutes. The worshipful master moved, and the Reverend Brother Captain T. Miller Johnson, chaplain, seconded, that we place on record on the minutes of our appreciation of Brother Gabriel Bullock, who gave his life in action in the Great War at Rossendale in France on September the 15th, 1918, and who was buried at Vincent Military Cemetery near Peron, France. Also that a photo of the deceased be procured, framed, and hung on the wall of the lodge. Despite there being some contemporary confusion regarding the name of his final resting place, Gunner Gabriel Bullock was buried with full military honours at Tin Court Military Cemetery near Peron. Touching tributes were placed in the obituary column of the local newspaper by his mother and surviving siblings, his aunt and uncle, numerous friends, and from Bob and Arthur, who described themselves as his true friends in France. The armistice was signed on November the 11th, signalling the end of the Great War. Victory had come, but at a very heavy price. For everyone involved, the world had changed forever. The Swan Hotel in the marketplace that once hosted Lodge of Amity meetings, and where the Bullock family once lived, was eventually pulled down. Gabriel's mother Elizabeth never remarried, and on November the 15th, 1936, at the age of 77, she died in Haslington, the town where she had been born and raised her family. His sister, Jane Alice Walmsley, passed away on March the 12th, 1956, aged 72 years. In the year after the war, the last surviving lad, his half-brother John William, was initiated into the Lodge of Amity using the Bullock surname, and was raised the following year. He passed away in the town, aged 77, in 1950. The headstone at St. James that commemorated Luke, Elizabeth, Robert, Gabriel and Jane, and incorporated a Masonic symbol, is sadly no longer standing. The fine new Conservative Club building, which opened in 1909, was demolished in 1997. And Haslingden Working Men's Club, which also once echoed to the sound of Gabriel potting billiard balls, closed its doors for the last time in the 1980s and was demolished during the following decade. The Swedenborgian Spiritualist Church closed some time towards the end of the 20th century and reopened as a gymnasium. The Lodge of Amity moved from their temple on Regent Street to a new Masonic hall in 1923, where it continued to meet before high running costs forced it to close in 2007. The lodge left the town the same year for its new home in Clayton-le-Moors, after having met regularly in Haslingden for the best part of 200 years. Throughout all this change, Brother Gabriel has continued to rest peacefully in his quiet corner of a foreign field. Time passes by, taking with it all living memory of the people behind the names of those who came before. It is important, therefore, that where we can, we act to preserve the stories of those who served in the Great War for posterity. By making this short film, we hope in a sense to have restored that which was lost, the story of the man and brother, Gabriel Bullock, who deserves to be remembered, lest we forget.